The sun hung low over the New Mexico desert, the kind of burning light that bleached everything to the same weary shade. Caleb Thorne rode tall in the saddle, a giant of a man who filled his brown vest and dust-worn shirt like a mountain fills the horizon. His broad hat shadowed a face carved by weather and silence, eyes dark and steady as he guided his horse down the crooked street of Prosperity Gulch. The town looked more ghost than alive. Boarded windows sagged, a livery leaned sideways as though it might collapse if someone breathed too close. Men stood outside the saloon without speaking, boots grinding against dirt that hadn't seen rain in months. A thin wind rattled loose shutters. It was a place that had given up hope long before the summer came to choke it dry. Caleb had crossed towns like this before, places that had forgotten how to dream. He'd learned to keep moving, to be just another silent rider heading nowhere. But this time, something stopped him cold. Near the center of the street, under the heat-struck awning of the general store, a girl stood by herself. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her dress, a pale shade of blue, hung loose on her thin frame, and her wheat-colored hair fell across a face that carried too much hunger for her age. Children across the square laughed and shoved each other, but none dared come near her. She was marked as different, left outside the circle of belonging. Caleb should have looked away. He should have ridden on. But the glint at her collarbone caught him, a sharp strike to his chest. Hanging there was a pendant, turquoise polished to a smooth gleam, carved into the wings of a falcon in flight. His heart staggered. He had made that carving once, years ago, for his little girl. The breath left him as if a hand had closed around his throat. For a moment, the sounds of the town boots scraping, a blacksmith's hammer, a horse's snort, faded into nothing. All that remained was that flash of impossible blue. He swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the dust. His size alone was enough to silence the street. He was taller than any man there, shoulders broad as the barn doors behind him, a scar running across one cheek like a pale lightning strike. Mothers clutched their children close. Whispers rippled across the boardwalk. The sheriff stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, a lean man named Elias Thorne, though no kin of Caleb's. His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver. "Easy now," Thorne said, voice low but carrying. "You keep your distance." But Caleb didn't hear him. His eyes were locked on the child, on the necklace, on the way the little falcon wings seemed ready to lift her toward the sky. His body moved without thought, each step heavy as thunder until his shadow fell across her small frame. The girl stiffened. Fear flickered in her wide eyes, the instinct of a cornered rabbit. Caleb stopped. His chest rose and fell once, slow and ragged. Then, in a gesture that silenced even the sheriff, he dropped to one knee. The crowd gasped, a giant cowboy kneeling before a hungry orphan. It was not the violence they expected. Caleb lowered his head, eyes fixed not on the girl's fear, but on the turquoise that burned against her skin. The girl's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Caleb's throat worked. He had not spoken to a soul in weeks, but the words came raw. "Where did you get that?" Before she could answer, a door creaked open. A woman stepped out of the general store, plain and tired, her dress faded from years of wash, hands roughened by soap and work. Her name was Adeline Finch, the girl's aunt. Her gaze landed first on Caleb, then dropped to the necklace, then to the faint line of a matching chain glinting from beneath Caleb's shirt. Her face drained of color. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, voice trembling. "I've seen that stone before." The sheriff's hand tightened on his revolver. The crowd pressed in, curiosity mixed with suspicion. "What's this about, Adeline?" Thorne demanded. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Caleb. "Years ago, my brother found a woman half dead by a creek bed. She had nothing but that necklace, No name, no past. He called her Sarah. She became his wife. And when she passed, she left the necklace to her daughter. She put a hand on the child's shoulder. This is Abigail Finch. The air grew heavier than desert heat. Caleb's vision blurred as the truth cut through him like a blade. His wife, Nidita, she had survived the raid, lived as another man's wife, raised another child, and now she was gone. Abigail looked up, confused. My mama wore this? She never told me why it mattered. Caleb reached into his shirt with a shaking hand. He drew out his own falcon, its turquoise surface worn smooth by years of grief. He held it in the open palm of a hand big enough to crush stone. Side by side, the two necklaces shone like mirrors in the sun. The sheriff swore under his breath. The townsfolk whispered louder, words sharp as thorns. Adeline's lips trembled. She was your wife, wasn't she? Caleb didn't answer. His silence was heavier than words. Abigail's eyes moved between the two pendants, then back to the giant kneeling before her. A flicker of understanding, small but certain, crossed her face. Behind them, the murmur of the crowd swelled, suspicion thick as smoke. The sheriff's hand hovered once more near his gun. The moment teetered, fragile as glass. Caleb met the girl's gaze and, for the first time in years, let her see the storm behind his eyes, sorrow, recognition, and a vow unspoken. He would not lose her, too. But before anyone could breathe, the church bell clanged from the far end of town. A rider galloped in hard, dust rising in his wake, shouting of strangers spotted near the western pass. The sheriff cursed, the crowd scattering into panic. Adeline clutched Abigail tighter. Caleb rose to his full, towering height, his shadow falling across them all. The turquoise falcon gleamed between them, no longer just a memory but a promise. And for the first time since the raid that had broken him, Caleb Thorne felt the world shift. Something was coming, something that would force him to choose between walking away again or standing to protect what little remained of the life he thought he had lost forever. Adeline Finch led the way down a side street, her hand steady on Abigail's shoulder, though her face showed how shaken she was. Caleb Thorne followed a step behind, boots heavy against the packed dirt, his broad frame filling the narrow space between the houses. He felt the weight of the town's eyes on his back, suspicion pressing like heat from the sun. But the necklace had bound him to the girl, and there was no walking away. Adeline's home sat on the ragged edge of Prosperity Gulch, where fences leaned into the wilderness and the last houses seemed more temporary than permanent. It was a simple place, clean despite its wear. The porch sagged, but someone had swept it that morning. The curtains were drawn, though sunlight slipped through in bright slivers across the wooden floor. Inside, the air smelled of soap and wood smoke. Abigail sat close to her aunt, watching Caleb with wide eyes. He filled the small room as though the walls themselves might bow to contain him. He kept his hat in his hands, not out of comfort, but respect. Adeline set a small box on the table. The wood was worn smooth at the edges, its lid polished by years of careful touch. She opened it slowly, like she was exposing a wound that had never healed. Inside were fragments of another life, a river stone, a feather, a pressed flower gone brittle with time. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth so thin it was almost gone, a carved flat stone with symbols faintly scratched across it. She never knew who she was, Adeline said quietly, but she held this for hours, as if it told her something she couldn't say out loud. Caleb reached forward, his scarred hand steady. He lifted the stone, tracing the lines with a fingertip. He knew them. A river meeting a mountain peak. The sign of a promise he once made to Nidita at the stream where he told her he would never leave her. His throat tightened. She had remembered, even if the rest of her memory had been stolen. Abigail leaned closer. It belonged to my mama? Caleb nodded once, his voice low. Yes. Adelaine's eyes softened, though grief deepened the lines on her face. She lived as Sarah here, but part of her heart was still elsewhere. I think she was always waiting for someone. Before Caleb could answer, heavy boots sounded on the porch. Sheriff Elias Thorne stepped through the door without knocking, his eyes hard. He looked at Caleb, then the open box, then at Adeline. "The town's whispering already," he said. "This man shows up, folks see 2 matching trinkets, and suddenly we've got ourselves a story. But a story don't put food on the table, and it doesn't ease fear. What we've got is a problem." Adeline straightened, her voice sharp despite her weariness. "He's no problem, Sheriff. He's a man who's lost as much as anyone I've ever known." The sheriff ignored her, eyes locked on Caleb. "You want to stay here? You prove yourself useful. There's a mountain lion tearing through stock, bold enough it came close to the Miller Ranch last week. Men have tried and failed to bring it down. You're a big man, Thorne. You want folks to see you as more than a shadow. You hunt that lion." Caleb rose slowly, towering above them all. He set his hat back on his head, the brown brim shadowing his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't make promises. He only gave the sheriff a single nod. Adeline frowned. "That's no fair test. It's suicide. Men with rifles couldn't find it." The sheriff shrugged. "Then we'll see what kind of man he is." When Thorne left, the house grew still again. Abigail looked at Caleb, fear and hope warring in her face. "Will you really do it?" Caleb crouched to her height, his voice a low rumble. "I've tracked worse. You'll be safe." The girl's eyes glistened. She didn't know why, but she believed him. That night, Caleb made a small fire outside, settling under the cottonwoods near Adeline's house instead of taking the bed she offered. He didn't belong under a roof, not yet. He sat with the turquoise falcon warm in his palm, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere beyond the hills, a lion cried, a raw, aching sound that carried loneliness as much as hunger. He closed his eyes, knowing his path was set. But in the shadows of town, another pair of eyes watched him. Jed Miller, the rancher's son, leaned against the saloon wall with a bottle in his hand, sneer twisting his face. He spat into the dirt. "Let's see how long the giant lasts." And as the moon climbed higher, Caleb Thorne prepared to walk into the wilderness, not knowing the hunt would reveal more than a wounded beast. It would expose the rot inside the town itself. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert, spilling over red rock and brush, as if the earth itself were waking. Caleb Thorne moved like he belonged to the land, heavy boots leaving deliberate prints in the dust. The air was sharp with sage, and every sound carried far the flutter of wings, the rasp of a lizard over stone, the faint echo of a coyote's cry. Abigail trailed behind him, her thin figure swallowed by a pale blue dress too big for her small frame. She clutched a tin cup of water in both hands, as though afraid she might drop the only thing of value she had been given. Every so often she glanced at the towering man ahead of her, as if trying to decide whether to trust him or run. Caleb paused at a dry wash, crouching low. He touched the earth with 2 fingers, then raised his hand to show a faint mark. "Lion," he said simply. 2 nights old." Abigail squinted. "I don't see anything." He almost smiled, though his face rarely allowed it. "That's because you're looking for a picture." Tracks tell stories, not drawings. He showed her the shallow indentation, then the pebble turned at a strange angle. It came down here heavy. Hungry, her eyes widened with something like awe. For the first time, she did not see a stranger, but someone who understood the silent language of the land. They moved on, the sun climbing higher. Caleb's mind wandered where he did not want it to go. Every track pulled him backward, to another path, another time. He saw his wife's dark hair catching the wind, heard his daughter's laughter at the stream. He remembered the day he carved the falcon from turquoise, how small Ayana's fingers had been when she reached for it. His other hand slipped into his shirt, closing around the necklace that never left his chest. He pulled out the flat stone Adeline had shown him. The lines etched on its surface were faint but unbroken, a river meeting a mountain peak. The vow he had carved with his knife when he promised Nidita he would never leave her. He rubbed it between his calloused fingers until the heat of his skin warmed the cold stone. Abigail watched him from the shade of a mesquite. "What is that?" she asked, her voice soft. "A promise," he answered. She tilted her head. "To who?" He looked at her then, and though the silence stretched, she did not flinch. His voice came like gravel across a riverbed. "To your mother." The girl's lips parted, but she said nothing. Something flickered in her eyes, fear, wonder, maybe both. She began to hum without realizing it, a strange, broken melody. Caleb froze. That tune, he had sung it as a lullaby when Ayana was a baby. The sound twisted through him like fire catching dry brush. "Where did you learn that?" His words came sharper than he intended. Abigail startled. "Mama hummed it sometimes, said she didn't know why. It helped her sleep." Caleb's breath hitched. For a moment he had to turn away, staring out over the endless scrubland so she would not see the moisture burning his eyes. His wife had remembered. Even when her mind was torn, some part of her had held on. By noon they stopped near a stand of cottonwoods. Caleb handed her a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. She chewed slowly, her face tightening at the toughness of the meat, but refusing to complain. He noticed the way she sat upright, how she tried to hide her hunger. "You don't have to pretend," he said. Her cheeks flushed. "I don't like to beg." "You're not begging. You're surviving." "There's a difference." For the first time she gave him a small smile. It was quick, gone almost before it appeared, but it lit her thin face in a way that made something long dormant stir in him. They pressed deeper into the hills, the trail freshening with each ridge. Caleb showed her how a broken stalk could tell direction, how the silence of birds meant a predator near. She listened closely, her curiosity spilling over into questions. Each answer he gave chipped away at the wall between them. Toward evening they found a patch of desert marigold, their yellow petals bright against the dust. Caleb stopped, crouching low to touch one with surprising tenderness. "Why are you looking at weeds?" she asked. "Not weeds," he said. "Marigold. My wife once told me a story. She said a marigold could bloom even in the harshest ground. She carried one once, as a promise we'd always find home no matter where we were driven." Abigail bent close, her small fingers brushing a petal. "So this flower was like hope?" He nodded. "Exactly that." Her hand lingered on the flower, as though she, too, wanted to hold on to something stronger than herself. The shadows lengthened, and Caleb made camp beneath an outcrop of rock. He built a fire with quick, sure movements. The flames painted his face in amber light, deepening the lines carved by years of solitude. Abigail sat across from him, her eyes reflecting the fire. "Are you going to leave after the lion?" she asked suddenly. The question hung in the air. Caleb stirred the embers, listening to the crackle before answering. "I've been leaving all my life." "But maybe not this time." Her breath caught. She said nothing more, but the set of her shoulders softened. When she finally lay down, wrapped in his spare blanket, Caleb sat awake, staring into the flames. The fire cracked and popped, but his mind filled with the lullaby, with the marigold, with the stone etched with a promise that had not died. Above them, the stars burned cold and distant. But near the fire, for the first time in years, Caleb felt something warm enough to burn through his grief. From the canyon beyond, a low roar broke the night, deep and guttural. The mountain lion was close, and its cry carried the weight of hunger and pain. Abigail stirred in her sleep, and Caleb's hand went instinctively to the rifle by his side. The hunt had begun, but it would not be just a test of his skill. It would be a reckoning that tied past and present together, one that would pull both him and the girl into the heart of the town's hidden rot. The desert dawn broke sharp and cool, carrying with it a silence that felt almost brittle. Caleb Thorne led Abigail up a narrow ridge, his stride steady, eyes scanning every sign the earth left behind. He could read the land as if it were scripture, every bent blade of grass, every scatter of stones, every silence where birds should sing. The mountain lion had come this way. He could feel it as much as see it. Its movements were uneven, desperate. The tracks dragged on one side, heavy, unnatural. Caleb paused, crouched low, and brushed his broad fingers over the print. The pad pressed deep, but one claw mark dragged like a crooked line. "It's hurt," he said. Abigail hugged her arms around her chest. "Does that make it less dangerous?" He shook his head. "More. A wounded animal fights harder. It knows it has no other choice." They moved down into a shallow wash, the smell of juniper sharp in the air. Caleb stopped again, pulling a single tawny hair from the thorn of a bush. He rolled it between his fingers before slipping it into his vest. His gut tightened. The lion was close, but so was something else. A trail of human boot prints cutting across the wash, fresher than the cat's. He turned to Abigail. "Stay here." Her lips parted, but she nodded, sinking against the rock as he moved forward, rifle ready but low at his side. The sound reached him first. The clatter of stones, followed by a muttered curse. Caleb eased around the boulders, and there he found him, Jed Miller, young and flushed, his rifle cocked but his eyes wide with fear. Jed's leg was pinned in a cruel steel trap, its jagged teeth sunk deep into his calf. Blood seeped into the dust beneath him. The stench of blood had drawn the lion. From the shadow of the rocks it crouched, ribs sharp under its hide, one paw twisted and mangled. Its golden eyes burned with pain, hunger, and fury. Jed saw Caleb and shouted, his voice high with panic. "Shoot it! Don't just stand there, kill it!" The lion growled low, a rumble that vibrated through the ground. Caleb raised his rifle but held his shot. His eyes darted to the trap, the cruel metal biting Jed's flesh. Then to the lion's paw, twisted by the same kind of iron. A memory struck him. His wife's face, his daughter's scream, the raid where men with iron and fire had taken everything. He saw not a beast, but another victim of human cruelty. Jed thrashed, "You deaf, Thorne?" "It's gonna tear me apart." Caleb's voice was calm, steady. "You did this." Jed's face paled. "What are you talking about?" Caleb pulled from his pocket a rusted fragment he had found days earlier near a spring, the broken half of a trap. He held it up, then looked at the one crushing Jed's leg. The jagged edges matched perfectly. Jed's trap. "You crippled it," Caleb said, his voice low but heavy. "You turned a hunter into a scavenger." Jed shook his head wildly. "It wasn't. It was just, damn it. I didn't mean for this." The lion shifted, dragging its mangled paw, preparing to spring. Caleb knew he had only seconds. He dropped his rifle into the dust, hands open. The crowd in town would never understand, but he did. The lion didn't want blood. It wanted escape. "Easy," Caleb murmured, stepping between Jed and the animal, his massive frame blocking the boy completely. His voice was low, soothing, the same way he had calmed skittish horses. "Go on now. You've suffered enough." The lion snarled, then limped backward, each step a battle against its own broken body. With a final ragged growl, it vanished into the rocks, leaving silence in its wake. Jed slumped, shaking, sweat slicking his brow. "You should have shot it." What kind of man lets a killer walk free? Caleb crouched, his hands moving to the trap. The kind who knows the real killer forged this iron. Jed flinched as Caleb wrenched the trap apart with sheer strength, the muscles in his arms straining. The jaws sprang open, releasing Jed's shredded leg. Caleb tore strips from his own shirt, binding the wound tight. Jed's voice broke. "Why help me? You could have let me die here." Caleb's dark eyes met his. "Because mercy is the only thing that keeps men from becoming worse than beasts." With Jed leaning heavy on his shoulder, Caleb half-carried him back toward town. Abigail rushed to meet them, her face pale with worry. She fell in step, silent, watching every movement of the giant who carried a boy who had nearly doomed them all. When they reached Prosperity Gulch, the crowd gathered fast, whispers sharp. Sheriff Thorne pushed through, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Jed's torn leg and the rusted fragment Caleb held out. "This is the truth," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the square. He dropped the broken iron into the sheriff's palm. "The lion wasn't the danger. Our own traps were," the townsfolk murmured, some with shame, others with anger. But none could argue. Their fear had worn the wrong face. The sheriff's gaze flicked from Jed's wound to Caleb's steady stance, then to Abigail standing at his side. Something shifted in his expression, respect carved where suspicion had lived. Caleb's shadow stretched long across the street as the sun dipped low. He knew the town would never be the same. The beast had been unmasked, and it wore a man's face, and far beyond the ridge, a rider with a red-flagged banner watched the smoke rising from Prosperity Gulch, spurring his horse toward the town with grim intent. The days after the lion hunt brought a shift in Prosperity Gulch. Whispers that had once branded Caleb Thorne as a threat softened into grudging nods, even admiration. He had dragged Jed Miller back half dead and proved the truth behind the wounded beast. The giant cowboy began to be seen in small ways, helping mend a fence with hands that could split logs in one swing, carrying water for the widow Hayes when her well rope snapped, fixing the church door so it would close against the wind. Some men tipped their hats now instead of spitting at his boots. Others held back, unsure, and still others grew louder in their resentment. For every voice of respect, another claimed he was a danger, a man with no rightful place among them. On Sunday, the town gathered at the clapboard church, its bell cracked but still ringing. Inside, Mrs. Prudence Clay, head of the Ladies' Temperance League and keeper of the town's so-called moral spine, rose to speak. She was a rigid woman with iron-gray hair coiled tight, her chin always tilted as if she smelled rot. "This town has survived fire and famine," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "But we will not survive corruption. It is not enough that he brings savagery into our midst. He now leads our children astray with tales of stars and beasts. Shall we welcome every drifter with blood on his hands? Or do we preserve what decency remains?" Her words carried, and many nodded. Caleb stood outside, leaning against the post of the church steps, hat low over his brow. He had not been invited in. Abigail slipped from a back pew to join him, her small hand brushing against his. She looked up with steady eyes. "You fixed Mrs. Hayes's well," she whispered. "That's more than most folks have done for her in years." Caleb said nothing, but the faintest crease touched the corner of his eyes. The shadows in town deepened when children began to circle Abigail in the dusty schoolyard. A boy yanked at the turquoise falcon on her chest. "Look at her," he sneered, "wearing a savage's trinket." "My pa says it's cursed." Abigail clutched the necklace, her chin trembling but lifted high. "It was my mama's," she said firmly. "It's mine now." They shoved her anyway, laughter sharp and cruel. She stumbled, dust streaking her dress. Then Caleb's shadow fell long across the yard. The laughter died. He said nothing, only looked at them, eyes like storm clouds. The boys scattered as if chased by thunder. Abigail rose, brushing dirt from her skirt, her eyes glistening but proud. "You didn't have to scare them," she muttered. Caleb's voice rumbled low. "Sometimes silence is the only lesson that stays." That evening, Sheriff Thorne stopped by Adeline's porch. He leaned on the rail, watching Caleb mend a broken chair with quiet precision. "You're winning some hearts," the sheriff said, "but you've stirred up a hornet's nest, too." Prudence Clay's got half the town listening. Folks don't like change, and you've changed more in a few weeks than most men do in a lifetime. Caleb didn't look up. "I didn't come here to change anyone. I came because a child wore what I once carved." Thorne studied him, then sighed. "Just watch yourself. Fear makes people foolish." The warning settled heavy. Caleb had seen what fear did to men. It had burned his village, stolen his family. He would not see it repeated here. Night fell and the wind shifted. In the distance, hoofbeats pounded hard and fast. A rider burst into town, his horse lathered, eyes wild. He slid from the saddle, voice breaking with panic. "Raiders!" he shouted. "A dozen at least, maybe more, flying a red flag with a coyote skull painted white. They're coming fast from the western pass." The words struck like a bullet. The saloon doors swung open, men spilling into the street. Mothers clutched children. The church bell began to toll, frantic and uneven. Caleb stood in the middle of the street, his massive frame a pillar against the chaos. His hand gripped the turquoise beneath his vest, his jaw set like stone. He knew that banner. He had seen it once before, rising above fire and smoke as everything he loved was torn away. The men who carried it were not strangers. They were the ghosts of his past, returned to finish what they had begun. The town swirled into panic, but Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. The storm was coming, and this time he would not run. The streets of Prosperity Gulch pulsed with fear. Men grabbed rifles from behind doors, women pulled their children into cellars, and the old bell in the church tower tolled so hard its cracked iron voice threatened to shatter. Dust drifted over the rooftops, carried by the hoofbeats of the raiders closing in. Caleb Thorne stood in the center of it all, his hat pulled low, the turquoise falcon burning against his chest. His eyes stayed fixed on the canyon mouth to the west. He had known this day would come. He just never expected the storm to ride in wearing a banner he had seen before, painted with a coyote's skull. Sheriff Elias Thorne came up beside him, rifle in hand. "You recognize that flag, don't you?" Caleb's voice was steady, but his jaw clenched. "I do." "They burned my people with it." The sheriff studied him a long moment. "Then we'll fight with you. But you'd best tell us what kind of men we're facing." Caleb didn't answer because at that moment the raiders poured into view, a dark wave of riders cutting across the mesa. Dust rose behind them like smoke, and at their head rode a figure Caleb knew too well. His chest tightened. The man's shoulders were broad, his seat in the saddle easy and sure. His black hair streamed behind him, tied with leather. His hand raised in silent command, and the raiders slowed, spreading out like wolves. Cale. Once, years ago, they had hunted together, two young warriors, laughing as they tracked deer across the ridges. Cale had been as close as a brother. Caleb remembered the night they had shared fire and bread, speaking of the families they would one day raise. Then came the raid, the slaughter, the smoke. Cale had vanished that night. Caleb had believed him dead. But now here he was, leading the very men who had destroyed everything. Caleb's voice came low, more growl than word. "Cale!" The raiders halted just out of rifle range. Cale dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with practiced ease. He walked forward, his men watching with cruel grins. "Caleb Thorne," Cale called, his tone mocking. "Or should I say, Son of Tan. The words carried, hitting Caleb like a hammer. He froze, stunned. That name Tan was his grandfather, a great Apache chief whose people had vanished into the desert a generation before. It was a name Caleb had never spoken aloud, passed only through bloodlines whispered in the dark. How do you know that name? Caleb demanded. Cale smiled thinly. Because the men who paid me to burn your village told me. They wanted your line ended, but you slipped through my fingers. I thought I would never see you again. Imagine my surprise when I hear of a giant cowboy protecting a whitewashed town, carrying his bloodline like a secret flame. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Is this true? Caleb's gaze didn't waver from Cale. My grandfather led our people with honor. If his blood runs in me, it is not a curse, Cale barked a laugh. Honor? There is no honor in ashes. I chose silver, Caleb. I chose life. And tonight, I choose victory. Caleb's fists tightened at his sides. You chose betrayal. Cale's grin sharpened. And you chose ghosts. Look at you kneeling before a white child, begging scraps from people who will never see you as their own. You think they'll fight for you? They barely tolerate you, Abigail, watching from the shadows of Adeline's porch, clutched the falcon necklace at her chest, eyes wide with terror. Caleb took a step forward, his voice like rolling thunder. This town will stand. Cale raised his hand, his raiders shifting restlessly, rifles gleaming in the fading sun. No, Caleb. This town will burn, same as yours did, and this time I'll make sure your bloodline dies with it. The coyote skull banner snapped in the wind. Cale turned to his men, his voice ringing across the canyon. Ride down Prosperity Gulch, leave nothing standing. The raiders howled, spurring their horses forward. Dust rose like a storm cloud, the sound of hooves thundering closer, and the shadow of war fell hard over the town. The first shots cracked against the canyon walls, echoing like thunder. Raiders surged toward Prosperity Gulch, their coyote skull banner whipping in the wind. The townsfolk scrambled, some ducking into homes, others clutching rifles with shaking hands. Panic was a living thing, ready to break them apart before the fight even began. Caleb Thorne strode into the chaos like a storm given flesh. He didn't raise his rifle. He raised his voice. Not the streets, he barked. The canyon narrows. That's where we hold them. Something in his tone steady as stone, commanding without demand, pulled men back from hysteria. Sheriff Elias Thorne caught the spark in Caleb's eyes and gave a sharp nod. You heard him. Move. Together they drove people to the natural defenses. Families fled to the old silver mine hidden in the hills, guided by Adeline and the other women. Men dug in where Caleb told them, behind wagon barricades rolled across choke points in shallow trenches that overlooked narrow trails. He showed them where to pile rocks for slides and how to set crossfire angles that would trap riders in deadly triangles. Jed Miller limped forward, his legs still bound from the trap, face pale but jaw clenched. Tell me where to stand, Thorne. Caleb's dark eyes studied him. Jed's shame still clung like smoke, but his rifle grip was steady now, his arrogance burned away by fear and truth. Caleb pointed to a ridge. There. Watch the pass. Don't waste bullets, Jed nodded and climbed, determination etched where swagger once lived. The raiders came hard. They poured into the canyon expecting an easy kill, but instead were met with a storm of lead. Shots cracked from hidden positions, riders toppled, horses screamed, rocks tumbled from above, triggered by townsmen, slamming into the path and scattering the charge. For a heartbeat, Prosperity Gulch held its breath. And then the impossible happened. The raiders faltered. The people of the town, once bound by suspicion and fear, moved as one under Caleb's command. Farmers who had never fired at more than coyotes fought like soldiers. Boys barely grown passed ammunition, hands steady. Even Sheriff Thorne, who had doubted Caleb, found himself following his signals without question. Still, Cale was no fool. He regrouped his men, pulling them back, circling wide. Flames soon licked the livery, then the assay office, smoke rolling into the sky. Firelight turned the dust blood red, painting shadows that leapt like demons against the walls of town. From the smoke, Cale's laughter carried, harsh and cruel. "Cowboy, you think you've made them a people. You think they'll ever be yours. Come down and face me." Caleb stood in the center of the street, the glow of burning buildings painting his massive frame in shades of scarlet. He could feel every eye on him, men who only days ago had doubted him, women who had whispered he was cursed. Now they waited, breathless, to see what he would do. Abigail clutched Adelaine's hand from the shadows near the church, her turquoise falcon pressed to her chest. She whispered, "Don't go," though no one could hear her. Cale rode forward, dismounted, and strode through the fire-lit haze. He pointed his blade toward the blacksmith's forge, its roof already smoking, sparks flying from within. "Meet me there. Show them what kind of man you are, or I'll burn this town to the ground and bury your bloodline with it." Caleb's jaw tightened. The forge iron, fire, the heart of the town's work was already half consumed by flame. To step into it was to walk into hell itself. The sheriff tried to grab his arm. "You don't owe him this." But Caleb shook free, his voice low but carrying. "I owe them everything." He walked through the smoke, each step steady, until the fire swallowed his shadow. Inside, chains rattled, hammers gleamed red, and Cale waited with a smile sharp as a blade. And as the doors of the forge slammed shut behind him, Prosperity Gulch held its breath, knowing the fate of the town now hung on the clash between two men bound by blood, betrayal, and fire. The forge was an inferno. Flames licked the rafters, smoke curled thick and choking, the stench of hot iron and burning pitch pressing into every breath. Chains swayed on hooks, glowing embers spit from the hearth, and the roar of the bellows filled the air like the breath of some great beast. Caleb stepped inside, his silhouette hulking against the blaze. Across from him, Cale waited, blade gleaming, his grin wide and venomous. "You've always been the quiet one, Thorne," Cale sneered, circling. "But silence won't save you here. Tonight you lose more than a town. You lose the bloodline you're too blind to guard." Caleb didn't answer. His voice would have been wasted on a man who fed on betrayal. Instead, he shifted his stance, broad shoulders squared, his eyes calm as stone though the heat blistered his skin. Cale struck first, fast, wild, but sharp with years of cruelty. His blade whistled, missing Caleb by inches as the giant cowboy sidestepped, letting sparks rain down from the iron rack. Caleb's size made him seem slow, but he moved with deliberate patience, every step measured. He wasn't fighting for rage or pride. He was fighting for Abigail, for Adeline, for the town that had finally trusted him. Steel rang against iron as Cale's blade clashed with a hanging chain. He snarled, swung again, forcing Caleb back toward the hearth. The flames painted them both in crimson light, sweat and soot mixing until they looked like creatures carved from the fire itself. "You think they'll ever call you one of their own?" Cale taunted, his teeth bared. "They'll spit on your grave the way they spit on your name. You're nothing but a shadow clinging to ghosts." Caleb's jaw clenched, but his voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Better a shadow that guards the living than a traitor who sold the dead." Cale roared and lunged, blade aimed for Caleb's chest. In that instant, Caleb's hand shot to the bellows lever. With one powerful heave, he forced it down. The forge screamed alive. A blast of scalding air roared through the firebox, carrying with it a cloud of glowing ash and searing embers. The cloud erupted straight into Cale's face. His scream was primal, a raw sound of agony. He dropped the blade, clawing at his eyes, stumbling backward as cinders clung to his skin. Blinded, he staggered, crashing into the rack of horseshoes. The iron tumbled, pinning him against the floor. The forge quieted, the roar of the bellows fading into the crackle of fire. Caleb stood over Cale, chest heaving, his massive frame lit by the glow of dying embers. For the first time, the traitor looked small, broken, writhing, his pride stripped away. Sheriff Thorne and Jed burst through the smoke, rifles ready. They froze at the sight, Caleb unarmed, Cale beaten not by brute force, but by cunning and the very tools of the town. Thorne barked orders. Jed bound Cale's hands with rawhide, hauling him upright. The outlaw spat blood, a crooked smile still twisting his burned lips. "You think this is the end?" Cale rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're a fool, Thorne. This was only the start. They'll keep coming. Not for the town, for you. You carry a name older than these hills. They'll never stop hunting until every drop of that blood is gone." Silence fell heavier than the smoke. The sheriff's jaw set, Jed shifted uncomfortably, and even the roar of the fire seemed to falter. The townsfolk gathered at the forge's broken doors, eyes wide, breaths held. Caleb stood motionless, staring into Cale's ruined face. The words hung in the air like a noose. This fight was won, but the war was far from over. And in that dreadful quiet, every soul in Prosperity Gulch understood. The danger was not finished. It was only just beginning. The fires in Prosperity Gulch smoldered for days, black scars carved into its streets and walls. Yet, when the smoke lifted, the town felt changed, not ruined. Men who had once eyed one another with suspicion now worked shoulder to shoulder, raising beams, hammering nails, patching roofs. The battle had burned away more than buildings. It had stripped away the walls they had built inside themselves. Caleb Thorne was no longer a shadow at the edge of town. He was the man who had stood between them and ruin, who had guided their hands and given them back their courage. Still, he didn't bask in their gratitude. Instead, he set his hands to quiet work. With lumber cut from the cottonwoods, he built a cabin near Adeline Finch's home, a sturdy square of pine timbers by the creek where the water ran cold and clear. Abigail followed him everywhere during those days. She carried nails in her apron, handed him tools, and watched his massive hands shape wood with patient care. To her, the cabin wasn't just boards and beams. It was proof that he wasn't going to vanish back into the wilderness. For the first time since her parents died, she had the anchor of a home being built before her eyes. Adeline often stood in her doorway, arms folded, her expression softening as she watched them. She had lived long enough to know that walls weren't built from timber alone. They were built from trust, from showing up day after day. And Caleb, for all his silence, showed up. Even Jed Miller changed. Humbled by his own shame and Caleb's mercy, he no longer swaggered through town. Instead, he lent his back to the rebuilding. He cut wood, fetched water, and even mended fences alongside Caleb without a word of protest. He was still proud, but his pride had shifted. Now it rested in honest labor instead of bluster. The sheriff, too, seemed altered. Elias Thorne carried himself with the weight of a man who had seen his town nearly broken and saved by someone he once mistrusted. He no longer kept his hand hovering near his revolver whenever Caleb passed. Instead, he tipped his hat. A small gesture, but one that meant more than a dozen speeches. The rhythm of life slowly returned. In the mornings, Caleb taught Abigail how to carve small animals from scraps of wood. She'd sit cross-legged on the porch of the cabin, her pale hair tangled by the breeze, while he guided her little hands with his scarred, steady ones. In the evenings, she'd read halting lines from a children's book, teaching him the letters he had never needed on the range. Adeline would listen from her kitchen window, her heart tight with a mixture of gratitude and grief for her sister who was gone, and for the strange gift of family left in her place. The creek sang through it all, its voice a low, constant song. Sometimes, when Abigail fell asleep early, Caleb would sit alone on the step of the cabin, the turquoise falcon necklace pressed between his fingers, listening to the water as though it carried whispers from the past. It might have ended there, in peace, but fate had more to say. One evening, as the town gathered at the saloon to talk of plans for rebuilding the livery, Sheriff Thorne sought Caleb out. He carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and when he laid it on the table, the room fell silent. "I thought you should be the first to see this," the sheriff said quietly. Caleb unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a map, hand-drawn and creased, taken from Cale's belongings before the outlaw had been hauled away in chains. The lines marked rivers and mountains, with two places circled: the ruins of Caleb's village and Prosperity Gulch. But there was a third mark, deep in the southern range. Beside it was a symbol carved in careful strokes, a falcon with wings spread wide. And beneath it, a single word: the source. The weight of it pressed on Caleb like a stone. He traced the falcon symbol with one calloused finger, the same shape he had carved years ago for his daughter, the same that hung at Abigail's throat. The room was hushed, every man and woman watching his face. Even Abigail, who had crept close without him noticing, stared wide-eyed at the map. Caleb looked at the sheriff, then at Adeline, then down at the girl who bore his lost family's necklace. His voice, when it came, was rough, barely more than a whisper. "This fight isn't over." The sheriff nodded grimly. "No, it's just begun." And with those words, the fragile piece of Prosperity Gulch trembled, for they all understood the fire they had survived was only a spark compared to what still lay ahead. Spring came slow to the high desert, but when it did, it came with force. The cottonwoods by the creek unfurled pale green leaves, the wildflowers spread like scattered paint across the valley, and the air softened with the promise of renewal. For the first time in years, Prosperity Gulch didn't feel like a place waiting to die. It felt alive. Caleb's cabin stood strong by the water, its timbers honey-colored in the morning sun. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, carrying the smell of cedar wood and bread. The cabin was not large, but it was enough. A hearth, a table, 3 chairs, a porch where the world slowed at dusk. For a man who had wandered too long, it was more than shelter. It was a root set into the earth. Inside, laughter broke the silence. Abigail sat cross-legged at the table, her small fingers gripping a carving knife too big for her hands. Caleb leaned over her shoulder, his bulk shadowing her as his scarred hand guided hers across a block of pine. Slowly, patiently, the wood yielded to the shape of a bird. "You press too hard," he murmured. His voice was low, like gravel softened by rain. She scrunched her nose, trying again. "Like this?" He nodded. "Better. Feel the grain. Don't fight it." Follow her tongue poked out in concentration, the knife shaving a curl that fell like a ribbon to the floor. "You make it sound like the woods talking." Caleb's eyes softened. "Sometimes it does." Later, when the carving was finished, Abigail set her knife down and snatched up a book. Its cover was worn, its pages thumbed thin. She placed it in front of him, flipping it open. "Your turn," she said, her grin mischievous. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, the sight of words still a strange frontier to him. He cleared his throat, tracing a finger along the first line. "The sky was blue." "Good," Abigail clapped, her joy bright as the morning. "Now faster." His mouth twitched with something close to a smile. He read haltingly, stumbling but determined, and when he faltered, she corrected him with all the authority of a schoolteacher twice her age. It was their trade. She carved his silence open, and he steadied her restless hands. Adeline stood in the doorway, a basket of laundry against her hip, watching them. Her heart ached in a way she could not put into words. For years she had carried grief like a stone in her chest, her brother gone, her sister-in-law dead, Abigail left in her care like a fragile ember she struggled to keep alive. Now, standing in the frame of sunlight, she saw something she thought she'd never see again. A family taking shape before her eyes. Neighbors noticed too. Sheriff Thorne often stopped by, tipping his hat in quiet respect. Jed Miller brought lumber without being asked, his penance hammered into every nail he drove into the cabin walls. Even the town's stern moral society, who once whispered that Caleb was a curse, had grown silent. The man who had saved them was no longer a stranger, yet not all shadows were gone. The map Sheriff had shown Caleb lingered in the back of his mind. The falcon symbol, the word, the source, the threat Cale had hissed before chains carried him away. Caleb knew there were storms still riding on the horizon, dangers not just for him, but for the bloodline he carried without ever asking. But he also knew this: storms could wait. For now he chose the present. He chose the girl who carved her first sparrow and grinned at him like it was a miracle. He chose the woman who brewed coffee at dawn and carried her quiet strength like armor. He chose the town that no longer looked at him with fear but with trust. One evening, as the sun slid down in a blaze of gold and crimson, Caleb sat on the porch with Abigail leaning against his side. The carved sparrow rested in her lap. The creek sang nearby, and the first stars pricked through the sky. "Does this mean you're staying?" she whispered sleepily. Caleb looked out across the valley, the scent of spring in the air, the warmth of her small hand in his. His chest tightened with the weight of the answer, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I'm home," he said simply. Adeline stepped onto the porch then, her eyes catching the light, and for the first time in years, she smiled without sorrow shadowing it. The cabin glowed warm behind them, a beacon against the dark. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. For in the Wild West, family wasn't always born of blood. Sometimes it was forged in fire, carved from grief, and sealed by the quiet, stubborn courage to choose each other. And so Prosperity Gulch slept under the spring sky, unaware that the falcon on Cale's map still cast its shadow. That story waited, a promise and a warning. But tonight the giant cowboy had found what he thought he'd lost forever: a daughter, a home, and a reason to lay down his wandering soul. If you've walked this trail with us, dear listener, don't ride off just yet. There are more tales of the West to come, of bloodlines and secrets, of courage and redemption. Subscribe to Western Legacy so you won't miss the next chapter in this journey through the untamed frontier. Now tell me, where are you listening from tonight?